Hey everyone, and welcome to the Color Suite. Today we're going to be taking a look at the basic and essential tools in DaVinci Resolve, what they do and how we can use them to do the majority of our color grading work. There's many other tools available to us in Resolve, but it's best to try use these as much as possible. They can do most of the work for you, and if you can avoid jumping to more specific tools too quickly, then you're going to have better results at the end. So these are the primary tools, and as the name suggests, we should be able to do most of our work with them. So as you can see, there are 4 sections to the primaries tool. There's the lift, gamma, gain, and offset control. So each of these controls have 2 different elements. There's the chroma element and the luminance element. And the chroma element is represented by this hue wheel over here, while the luma element is represented by the slider knob down at the bottom. Each of these 3 sections interact with the grayscale of the image in different ways. So let's use this grayscale chart over here to try understand what each of these tools are actually doing, so that when we make an adjustment, we're making it with knowledge of which part of the image it's actually going to affect. One thing to note quickly, if you don't understand how a grayscale chart relates to a real image exactly in terms of figuring these tools out, just think of it as every single image is built up of a black and white image, and then there's color information embedded in each of those pixels as well. If we look at an image like this, there is in the shadows both a value of hue and a value of grayscale. So this value over here may be in fact the same color value as that over there, but thanks to it being a darker luminance value, it looks darker and it creates shadow. So in that way, when we're trying to figure out what controls we need to use to affect this part of the image, we should really be thinking in terms of what is the grayscale element of that. Is it an highlight, is it a midtone, or is it a shadow that we need to control in order to affect that part of the image? So let's start by turning the lift control, its luminance element, upwards and seeing what it does to the grayscale picture. Over here I have a waveform which is set to luminance only mode. This represents our grayscale chart. So when we move this, we should see a corresponding movement on the waveform. Okay, so as we lift in this control, what we can see is it essentially pivots from 100%, and the darkest part of the image is what you're really controlling, and everything else sort of just moves in line with that. So your midtone information is shifting when you move this control. Now that's all well and fine in terms of how the black value can be manipulated, but what about color? How does that influence this chart when we work only within the lift tool? Well, let's add some blue to the picture and find out. So as we add more blue, you'll see that the highlights of the image are not really being affected, and there's a sort of growing amount of blue being injected into the image as we get to the shadows. If I switch my scope over here over to RGB form, then you can see that is essentially the blue channel lifting up more than the rest of the red and green channels. As we push more and more blue, you can see how that's rising, and some of these other channels are actually reducing in order to allow for this much blue in the dark shadows. But you can see that the chroma part of the element still reacts the same way as the lumen element. It's locked in over here, and it all just sort of pivots from that point all the way to the bottom. Now let's look at the gamma control and see how that reacts. You would probably expect that it would take, say, the middle point of your image and pull and push from there, but what we'll find is, in Resolve at least, there's actually sort of a heavy lean towards the bottom part of the image. One example of how we can maybe use these 2 controls together now is as I reduce the gamma by quite a bit, and I can lift the lift controls, and as you can see, it's doing what you'd expect. Therefore, you create sort of greater area of darkness compared to what originally was. If I disable this, it looked like that. Now it looks like this. So we have what visually to me appears to be a more even ramp. And now let's look at the gain control, which, as you most likely have figured out by now, will do the exact opposite of the lift control and pivot from the bottom of the image. Gain works more or less as you'd expect. You can see that it's pretty much still just the opposite of lift, and this makes it quite easy trying to correct the white balance of a shot or affect the overall white balance for a stylistic reason. You might want it like a cool image, or you may want a warm image, or you can see how it applies a sort of color into your entire image. And it's quite natural because your shadows stay more or less neutral. Lastly, let's talk about the offset control. You could call it overall or master control. It takes all of these, puts them all in one, and does it all at once. So if we move our luminance here, you'll see that the entire image just moves up and down, as it's not moving any part of the image more than another. It's a completely linear control. This can be really useful for exposure, as you might want to just move your entire exposure. In general, exposure in a camera is more or less an offset control. Once again, also same for chroma. You can see how the lines move completely, in parallel to each other. It has its places, but the chroma element of offset is not as useful, as you don't normally want to induce such a strong color cast to your shadow region. Finally, as part of the primary controls that you'll be using for most of your work, let's look at this little bar down here. You get the contrast, pivot, saturation, hue, and lumen mix controls. Contrast does what you'd expect it to do. It induces a sort of S-shaped curve into your image. Secondly, the pivot control is one that is very handy, but a little bit confusing at first, because as you move it, it doesn't do anything. However, let's hit that 0.5 and then up our contrast. Now, as we move pivot now, you can see what this is doing is actually changing the sort of center of where the contrast control functions. So you use that to control what part of the image are you trying to add contrast to. Sometimes it's not just the middle of the image, it's actually the highlights where you want to really add in that contrast. And as you can see, this kind of does a similar thing to this gamma lift trick that we were trying earlier. Next is the saturation control. I'll come back to that in a moment, because I want to compare it to another tool that we have available on the second page, and I have some charts for that and we'll look into it. The hue control over here shifts the overall position of the hue chart. So for example, let's look at this chart over here. If we move the hue control, you'll see that all the colors start changing. You can just imagine the hue control is twisting this entire hue angle around, and the original color becomes a new color, and they all move in the same amount to one another. This is not that useful, and you don't use it often. So let's look at the second tab of these controls. These are more sort of shortcutty controls that combine a lot of the effects of what we could manually do over here, and just makes them sort of easy sliders available for us. So first up, we have temperature. All that does is essentially locks your gain control specifically in this axis, from red, yellow to blue, cyan. So what's nice about it is it means you're not accidentally inducing magenta or green into your picture when you're just sliding this up and down. Next is your tint, which is the exact opposite. It just switches between these two values without accidentally adding any amount of red or blue into the image. And we can see that once again is essentially a gain control. It's pivoting from the black point upwards. Midtone detail is an interesting one. So what you'll notice is as we increase this, the skin and sort of midtone information in the picture is going to become more contrasty. There you can see it. And if we reduce it, if we go into negative numbers, it sort of softens it because it's becoming less contrasty. So sometimes you want to apply that a little bit to a face to soften it up a bit. But you want to be very gentle with this control, because it can look really fake really quickly. Then finally, I'd like to just look at our saturation controls. Over here I have an image. This is red, green and blue, different values of saturation, but all of the luminance values for this image are 100%. If we took our saturation and dialed it up to 100 and did nothing else to the image, the result we would get would look like this. And what you can see is it's definitely doing its job. It's adding saturation to the less saturated parts of the image. But now let's see if we were to not add anything to our saturation control and we only added something to our color boost control, what would it look like? Well, it would look like this. And as you can see, it doesn't look that different. If I switch back and forth between the two of them, this is saturation and this is color boost. And in fact, saturation is doing a bit more to the desaturated elements than color boost is. If we come over here to our next image, which I've created, this is the exact same as this. The only difference is instead of all these values being 100% luminance, we're now looking at about 25%, maybe even 10% luminance. Now, if we were to just do our saturation control, this is what it does. However, if we add color boost rather, you'll see that there's actually a lot more going on. So now color boost is doing a lot more than saturation was. basically what this means and what's good for you to know is that saturation deals with the saturation of highlights, and color boost deals with saturation of shadowy parts of the image. So there you go. That's all the controls that you need to do your primary grading. I hope that is helpful, and please do let me know in the comments if this tutorial series could be better in any way. So keep well, and don't forget, practice makes perfect.